Hello and welcome to The Agenda with Crystal Risotti. I'm your host, Crystal. I want to welcome you to tonight's episode. We're going to be talking about the global education system and initiatives from both the UN and also our United States organizations that are in charge of education as well. So if you've watched the prior episodes, if you haven't, I encourage you to do so. But if you have, you know that we've talked about the United Nations and different entities and tentacles off of that, like the WHO, the WEF for the economy, the healthcare, and we've talked about the communist goals before, but I just want to do kind of a quick run through of those again so that we can bring everybody up to speed who may not have watched them yet. And again, if you haven't, you're going to want to go watch them. Let's start with Slide 1, we're going to talk about some scriptures as Christians in regard to teaching and training our kids. So in 2 Timothy 3:16, it says, all scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. I believe that verse is critical because we need to start with the biblical perspective as Christians. We need to start teaching our kids that very young. We need to make that the foundation of everything else that's built on it. Romans 15:4 says, for whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. That one is actually something that I feel is important because it's talking about the scriptures being written in earlier times. And again, just pointing out it's for instruction, it's for training. That's the whole purpose of the Bible. Again, foundational. 1 Timothy 4:13 says, until I come, give attention to the public reading of scripture, to exhortation and teaching. And again, there's that word teaching, talking about reading the Bible, giving it to the public. The Bible says, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And that's part of this as well. Daniel 1:5 is coming from a different perspective. It's talking about an Old Testament situation with Daniel. And it says the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter into the king's personal service. Now, this one's unique to me because it actually implies the first public education system, if you will, where multiple people attended a school entity. I also want to point out to you, think about that. The reason they were going to school was to enter the king's service. So school was training for their career, basically. Again, that's another foundation I think that we need to be looking at teaching through that lens, because it is something that has always traditionally been to prepare people for the workplace. Prepare kids for the workplace. That was the role. It's changed over time, and we're going to talk about that. Proverbs 1:8 says, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. This is illustrating that teaching starts in the home. As far as biblical Christianity, it should be starting in the home, a very young age. We need to train up our children, and that's the next verse, Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way that he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So those are just some Bible verses to kind of form the perspective of our role as Christians and how we should be training and teaching our kids. Now, ultimately, we send them off to schools, but ultimately we as the parents do hold the responsibility for the teaching and training of the kids. Even with public education, that is supposed to be, again, of the people, by the people, and for the people, because it is a government entity. And so I want you to keep that in mind. That means we as Christians are part of society that drives how those entities should be working. And you're going to see the application to that throughout tonight. So in 1 Timothy 4:13, again, we talked about that. It's that we need to give attention to teaching. Do you think that only meant Christianity, though, or the Bible itself? Do you think that when Timothy stated that, he meant to give attention to all teaching? I kind of think that might be what he meant. Should we be giving attention to what our kids are learning in school or when they're away from us? Absolutely. Ken Ham, if you know who he is, he's actually out of Kentucky. He is the one that runs the organization that owns the Creation Museum and the Ark. And Ken Ham has written many books. He's published. He's well known in the Christian community. He made a comment one time, and it really stuck with me. He said, would the Israelites turn their kids over to the Palestinians to train them? And I really think we need to be focused on that and thinking about that. The answer is no. The Israelites would not have turned their kids over to pagans to train. They would have been training them themselves. They could not trust any kind of organized group of people around them. Everyone hated the Jews all the way back in history. So they would not have done that, and they wouldn't have taken the risk of their kids learning paganism as their life method at all. I want to move now to the communist goals. Again, we really talked about this before in the other episodes, so in detail. So if you haven't watched them, please go back and watch them. The communist goals are actually taken from a book called The Naked Communist, which is a book by Willard Cleon Skousen, but he was an anti-communist. So he was more of somebody who was fighting communism. He exposed the communist goals, which then were read into the congressional record in 1963 in the United States. And these communist goals, I mean, they've been in place for decades. We talked about before how they've now had decades to implement these things. And as we read through them, we can check them off. We see the fruit of all their efforts over all these decades in building organizations and putting people in places to further their agenda. Slide 2, please. The first one that has to do with the schools is get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of the teachers' associations. Put the party line in textbooks. Goal number 18, gain control of all student newspapers. Goal number 19, use student riots to foment public protests against programs or organizations that are under communist attack. So this is talking about actually communist organizations that are under attack. Number 17 is what we're going to talk about tonight. Get control of the schools. Let's go to slide 3. The ones 17, 18, and 19 apply to schools directly, but there's some that indirectly apply that I wanted to talk about. Goal number 24, eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Now, that's a broad goal, but it does apply to the school systems and things that are going on in the schools. You might have heard the terms book banning. I love it when I hear that because I'm like, it's not banning books. If you were banning books, they wouldn't be available to the public at all. That's not the case. Many parents across the nation, me included, have been fighting for getting the obscenity out of schools. I don't understand why these people have a desire, a drive to provide this kind of content to kids, but it's inappropriate. And next episode, we're going to talk about that in more detail. I'm going to bring the receipts on that. And we're going to show some pictures and talk about some content that might get me banned on YouTube. I don't know. But we're going to talk about it anyway because it's important.
We'll do it together.
Yes, let's go. Rule number 25, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. These definitely directly affect kids, but not necessarily through the schools only. We see that every day. Rule number 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. We're going to talk about that in the next episode as well and how the schools are doing that. Let's go to slide 4. Number 27, infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. Number 28, eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools in the grounds that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. Gee, where have we heard that before? Number 29, discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned, out of step with modern needs, a hindrance to cooperation between nations on a worldwide basis. That right there with the communist goals is a keystone for the globalist agenda with education. I want you to notice, again, the book was written in the late 50s, and these communist goals were read into the congressional record in the early 60s. So this goes way back, folks. This has been an ongoing thing for a long time. We think this, United Nations push or New World Order or things like that are new, and they're not. And that's the point of that. Goal number 30, discredit the American founding fathers, present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the common man. We've been hearing a lot of that in schools. Number 31, belittle all forms of American culture and discourage the teaching of American history on the ground that it was only a minor part of the big picture. Give more emphasis to Russian history since the communists took over. Okay, that last part really doesn't apply to us, but the first part sure does, and I'm sure you've been seeing some of that as well. Goal number 32, support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, meaning education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics, etc. Here we're talking about the socialist movement to take over schools and infiltrate. That has been going on. Again, we're going to talk about the fruit of all that. Number 33, eliminate all laws or procedures which interfere with the operation of the communist apparatus. And then let's not forget these. Let's go to slide 5. There's more. But wait, there's more. Dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. We're not seeing that going on right now. We're looking at the psychiatric profession. We're looking at the infiltration into that profession, which then filters into the schools through the clinical people in the schools, the school counselors, clinical psychologists in the schools, basically using those health laws against us who oppose communist goals in a coercive manner. We're going to see evidence of that in this episode because that's really, really important. Number 40, discredit the family as an institution, encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. We're going to talk about discrediting the family as an institution in this episode, and then we're going to talk about the promiscuity in the next one, so stay tuned. Number 41, emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents, attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. That's going on en masse right now across the country. We have children being taken from their parents because they won't use the proper pronouns in the state's mind. This is really, again, the schools are supposed to do what the people want. They're employees of the people, we the people. It's kind of backward at this point, and they're partnering with other government agencies to punish the parents that aren't behaving the way they think they should. It's despicable. Goal number 42, create the impression that violence and insurrection are legitimate aspects of the American tradition, that students and special interest groups should rise up and make a united force to solve economic, political, or social problems. We are seeing protests all over the place on university campuses, particularly for the Gaza war and Israel war. The Gaza and Israel war. Those are political and social problems. That's one right there. You've got Ukraine against Russia. That's a political problem, and I think fully a political problem, although it's causing us an economic problem in this country because we're sending all our money over to Ukraine. It's another story. These kids are seeing this kind of stuff, okay? And they're also being influenced by teachers at school. We do have activist teachers, and we're going to demonstrate that too. we talked about, let's go to slide 6, the United Nations and CDC targeting healthcare with mental health and the relationship to spiritual health. And again, we're going to go back to these UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs as they're referred to, because number 4, you're going to see, is all about education. You see it up there in the top? It's all about education. So we're going to dive into that. Let's go to slide 7, please. This is the first thing that you see when you open that goal 4. The top level says ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. That in a nutshell is what their sustainability goal number 4 is about. They use these other things to kind of promote that. So we're looking at the achievement in quality education, falling far behind. We have the pandemic referenced. We have primary and secondary school completion rates listed. So basically they're acknowledging the decline in education globally, because this is, again, a global initiative. And they imply that the pandemic contributed to the decline, and it did. But the decline was already happening before the pandemic hit. So I just need everybody to know that. We're going to talk about how you can find that out. Note their focus on lower and middle income countries when they're talking about the money, the finance gap. Countries in the UN are expected to contribute to these other countries to improve their targets. And yes, that includes the US. And we're talking money. Lots of money going. Let's go to slide 8, please. So when we look at the targets for the number 4 goal, and remember that you have the goals, and then underneath those goals are targets. We're going to look at some of these. Each target then has indicators, and it's kind of guidance on what you should do to demonstrate or activate the target. So target number 4.1, by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. So this is talking about your preschool stuff. So we've heard a lot about free preschool, and we need preschool for kids, and parents can't afford it, so let's send them to preschool. There's a big push for that. So let's look at the indicators. 4.1.1 says proportion of children and young people in grades 2 and 3 at the end of primary and at the end of lower secondary achieving at least a minimum proficiency level in reading and math, and they're grading that by sex, which I find very interesting. Let's look at number 4.1.2 indicator, the completion rate for primary education and lower secondary education and upper secondary education. So what they're talking about here is they want to see how many kids are completing those grades. Slide 9, please. The target is 4.2, and they're saying by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care, and primary education, so they're ready for primary education, pre-primary education, sorry. The indicators, proportion of children aged 24 to 59 months who are developmentally on track in health, learning, and psychosocial well-being by sex. So yes, they're tracking all of this. Again, this is pushing the preschool initiative, and of course they want it to be free. 4.2.2 indicator says participation rate in organized learning 1 year before the official primary entry age by sex. Again, that's another tracing thing they're doing. They want kids to not just be put in preschool, but complete the preschool. They want to know all the data by their sex. So they're splitting out the males and females. And I also find it funny how, the UN is pushing gender ideology, and yet all these are classified by male and female. So go figure. All right. So then we've seen these things being pushed, the preschool, the free school, all of these different things. But I bet you didn't know it actually came from the UN to start with. The UN, I've been telling you, is the global entity. There's 135 countries in the world, and 134 belong to the UN. It is a global government. They get by with telling you, you're still a sovereign country because we're not telling countries what to do. But they are making the recommendations. And again, they're coercing countries into abiding by them. So you might as well say they're calling the shots. I want to look at slide 10 next. You can pull that up. This is another aspect that they're focused on, psychosocial well-being and health. And this is from the psychosamatic.org website. I want to point out some of the things that they're looking at here. And I want you to ask yourself, why are we trusting a global entity with no invested interest in our citizenry to determine the psychosocial well-being of a child? What does that mean? You saw in the targets and indicators for the education system that they actually want psychosocial health being pushed as well. So let's look at some of these. One is living a life of purpose, feeling positive emotions, maintaining optimism for the future, experiencing a sense of mastery or accomplishment, and having close connections with other people. So listen, I'm all for kids being taught manners and how to behave. I'm all for that. There's nothing wrong with that. But as a Christian, I don't know that I want secular people teaching my kid those things, because those are subjective things. When we're talking about living a life of purpose, how would a secular person define that? What is a life of purpose to someone who's not a Christian, who's a secularist or a humanist? What does that mean to them? And why are they deciding what my child should be taught about a life with purpose? How do they decide that? Why do they decide that? Do they have the right to decide that, or is that my job as a parent? The second one, feeling positive emotions. Again, I have no problem with these on face value, but when you think about them, you have to ask yourself as a critical thinker, what do they mean by this? What is the definition of positive emotions for them? We're going to know by the end of this episode. Maintaining optimism for the future. What the heck does that mean? And how do they teach my child how to maintain optimism for the future? Are they just going to teach them that everything's rainbows and unicorns and we just need to be optimistic about the future? Because, my Bible kind of speaks a different story about the future if we believe we're living in the last days, which I do. We have hope in Christ. I don't know that the world really has a lot of hope. So to me, whatever optimism they have as a secular person or a humanist is very shallow. It's not worth anything to me. So that's another thing. I want to kind of jump off on a tangent here a little bit because I have a personal story to jump in with. Again, these have been around for a really long time. The whole definition and push by globalists to infiltrate the education system. My child was born in 94 and he started school in 99 in kindergarten. And the first thing I was told in the kindergarten class about midway through the year by the teacher was that she thought he had ADHD. And I asked her why she thought that. And she said, well, he was holding his crayons, 3 crayons with one hand. He was writing with his other hand and he was chewing on his shirt. And my response was, well, that's called multitasking. And my work pays big money to teach grownups how to do that. That kind of shut it down. But I couldn't understand why they were trying to label him. Why did they want to put a label on him? And how do you determine that he's ADHD because he's holding crayons and a pencil and writing and multitasking? In my mind, I didn't understand that. Well, that was kindergarten. Then he goes to first grade at a whole different school. because he was in a preschool for kindergarten. And admittedly, we moved a lot when I was a single mom because I always had to change jobs, and then I wanted to live close to my job so that he went to school close to my job so that if I had to ever leave, I could. And it wasn't a big deal. So for first grade, he went to a different school, and they continued with the ADD, not ADHD, ADD narrative. And I fought it and just wouldn't let him label him. I just disagreed with them. Now, he was an only child, and if you're an only child, you kind of know there's an only child syndrome, what I like to affectionately call it. He wasn't really social with other kids because he was around adults a lot, and he was a bookworm, and he loved to read books. He loved creative things. He got into video games later, so he was really a gamer. But he was not a sports kind of kid, and he wasn't like a really rambunctious or dynamic kid. Didn't have a lot of friends just simply because he didn't see the need for it. So he didn't have social skills, and it turns out that's what they were focused on. I found out much later. So he goes to another school for second and third grade, and in second grade, all of a sudden, they think he has autism. And I speak to the principal about it. He calls me in and he tells me he thinks he has autism. And when I questioned it, he said, well, we have a lot of autistic kids in our school. And I thought, how? How is that even possible? I mean, if somebody's full on autistic, you can kind of see traits. Not always, but, there are traits that you see of autism. He didn't have any of those. I also didn't see any other kids in his school that had those traits. So that was kind of a red flag, or just like a card that I filed away. But again, I fought it, and I actually took him to a behavioral center to have him tested, and he came out with nothing. Like they said, he doesn't have it. So I took my paperwork back to the school and put it on their desk and said, he doesn't have anything. Thank you very much. And I walked away. Third grade comes around, and they figured out they couldn't win with autism, so now it became Asperger's. They thought he had Asperger's syndrome. So again, I'm fighting it. I didn't act on it. I just kind of let that go. We moved to another school system for fourth grade, and in that school system, they really, really pushed and said, he had, I forget if it was, pick one, ADD, autism, Asperger's, but they were still trying to push for that. And I kind of suspect it's because his file followed him, right? So once it's in the file, it follows you. And so I had to fight the school on that year. Well, so we had an initial case conference in the spring and another one in the fall. And in the fall, the psychiatrist shows up, and I'd never met her before, never seen her before. I didn't know who she was, and they introduced her. And she said in fourth grade, they started to do a lot of lecture type teaching to prepare the kids for middle school. She said he had a hard time sitting there through the lecture teaching. And so she thought he had ADD because of that. My response was, having worked with adult training for many years at my workplace, plus my whole family are all teachers, essentially, I knew about learning styles. And I said, well, and this has changed since then for all you haters that are going to say, oh, there's more than 3 now. There were only 3 at the time: kinesthetic, audio, and visual. And so I looked at her and I said, well, he's clearly not getting the auditory listening. He doesn't have that skill. He needs kinesthetic or visual. So instead of trying to force him to adapt to lecture style teaching, perhaps you need to go back and evaluate your teaching methods to accommodate all the learning styles for the kids. And she put her pencil down and she sat up straight and she didn't say another word. But they convinced me to put him in an IEP program for some they said emotional issues. So we didn't get him labeled. They just implied he had some emotional issues. The problem was he was selectively a perfectionist. So if he couldn't finish his paper on time, and he was very meticulous about trying to write properly because they kept bashing him for his handwriting, then he would cry because he was really dedicated to trying to do a good job. So things like that. So I agreed to that. And long story short, we moved to Virginia when he was a sophomore in high school. In between fourth grade and the sophomore in high school age, I tried to get him out of the IEP, and the schools would not let him out. I could not get him out of the IEP program. And I had a conversation with his school counselor, and I said, do they get money for every kid that's labeled? And she said, yes. And I said, well, now I know why he can't get out of the program. So it's the first thing we did when we moved to Virginia. When I registered him, I said, I do not want him in an IEP. He has not used any of the accommodations, which, by the way, escalated to be ridiculous. And so I was able to get him out because we moved out of state. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm in conflict with that as a parent. And I do not think they're the experts. And I don't trust, and I don't think you should either, without verifying. So, you have to be your child's advocate, your child's biggest advocate, and you have to fight for them. Let's go to slide 11. We're going to look at target 4.5. By 2030, eliminate gender disparities in education and ensure equal access to all levels of education and vocational training for the vulnerable, including persons with disabilities, Indigenous people, and children in vulnerable situations. And then their indicators are parity indices, meaning female to male, rural to urban, bottom to top wealth quintile, and others such as disability status, Indigenous peoples, and conflict affected as data become available for all education indicators on this list that can be disaggregated. So long story short, that's a lot of words for basically they want to focus on eliminating boy and girl disparities, boy versus girl disparities. And they want equal access to all education and vocational training for those that are less fortunate, in other words. So this goes back to equity versus equality. That's what this is dealing with. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, so file that away. We'll come back to it. I want to also point out that parity indices of female to male, rural to urban, bottom to top wealth quintile, and within that, they include disability, indigenous people, and conflict affected. What does conflict affected mean? Again, you want to think it's intuitive, but you can't. You have to question what those definitions mean. I don't understand really why they split these out the way they did. Again, conflict affected, I don't know what that means precisely. I can estimate what it means, and I can deduce what I think it means. But again, I'm not doing that unless they tell me their exact definition. The point is, it's just very subjective. They can make it be whatever they want it to be. I don't see any definitions of these things listed anywhere in my studying, in my research. So to me, that means whoever I talk to or whoever I'm dealing with is going to be able to define that however they want. Let's go to slide 12, target 4.6. By 2030, ensure that all youth and a substantial proportion of adults, both men and women, achieve literacy and numeracy. Okay, that sounds great. Let's look at how they are going to gather that information. Proportion of population in a given age group achieving at least a fixed level of proficiency in functional literacy and numeracy skills, and again, by sex. So they're tracking all of that. What are proficiency skills? Is that tied to the standardized testing by chance? Not sure. Speaking of proficiency scores, did you know there's actually a website where you can check your school's proficiency scores? You can actually go in and search and find your particular school and look at what their proficiency in math and reading are in English. And they're dismal in Indiana, I can tell you that. I believe the highest was maybe in the 60s, and that's for across the state. I don't know about you, but when I was in school in the 60s was an F. That was a fail. But they tout that because comparatively, those schools in the 60s are doing better than the ones in the 40s. I mean, there's a whole lot more of them in the 40s than in the 60s. So I want to encourage you to check out your schools and look at the proficiency data. Okay? You can do that through the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's a website. You can look it up on Google. It has data tables. Or you can do it through chalkbeat, which we're going to look at slide 13. This is the one that I found to be the best for my research. And I looked at Indiana schools, but as soon as I opened it, I see this title of this article: Modest Gains for this year's Indiana test scores after pandemic declines. Well, can we just go to that highlight, Josh? The website, yeah. Thank you. Because I'm going to talk through this for a minute. If you look at these scores, you can see the English language arts and math percent proficient. These are all the Indiana schools, and as you scroll down, you'll see different school systems, but there's also a search bar at the top, so if you want to put in a specific school, you can. That one right there, go back down a little bit. That one right there, there's one school that's 65.1% proficient in math and reading. I believe it's math and reading, right? At the top. That column header. That's the highest out of the whole state. Look at the one below it, 28%, give or take. I'm looking at, what am I seeing? 31%, 33%, 28%. I mean, these are ridiculous scores, proficiency scores. These are Indiana schools, and these are the best they got. This is the best they've got. All right. And I can tell you so if you go to the chalkboard website that we're showing now, there is also kind of a graph, and it shows 2019, 2021, and 2022. And you'll see, you're not going to see it on there, Josh. You will see kind of a dip during COVID, during 2020. You'll see a dip go down, and then it picks back up in 2022 and 2023. All right. But if you click on the data for 2019, which was pre-COVID, technically, they say, if you click on the data for 2019, it's lower than it is for like this past year. So COVID the pandemic didn't affect the scores. I'm telling you from the research I've done, they were on a decline before that for years, decades even. Let's go to slide 14. Can we switch back to the slide? Sorry. This is something from the chalkbeat website from that article we were talking about. They said Indiana students' test scores rose slightly this year after dropping in 2021 due to the pandemic. See, they're pointing it to the pandemic, but if you look at the data before it, it was worse. The results of this year's state testing for grades 3 through 8 showed that 30.2% of students statewide scored proficient or better in both English and language arts and math, an increase of 1.6 percentage points over 2021. 2021 was also during COVID, right? So I believe this is 2022 data, actually. This article is dealing with that. So then it says, additionally, 41.2% of students statewide scored proficient or better in English and language arts, and 39.4% scored proficient or better in math, an increase in roughly 1 percentage point and 3 percentage points respectively. So the first paragraph is talking about grades 3 through 8. The second paragraph is overall. And then the last paragraph says the scores remain below pre-pandemic proficiency rates and the recovery among various student groups has been uneven. Again, I'm going to tell you, this article is based on 2022 data and it's focused on the pandemic. But if you look up your school's proficiency scores historically, they were lower before the pandemic. Or actually, they did dip during the pandemic, but they were lower than now before the pandemic. So it makes no sense. And then another thing it goes into saying roughly 19% of Black students and 28% of Hispanic students were proficient in English and language arts compared to 48% of white students. So they're making the point that, the ethnicity has something to do with it. The article that is posted on Chalkbeat talks about something called the Mind Trust. And this organization's intent is to transform schools. Let's go to slide 15. The Mind Trust strives to provide every Indianapolis student access to an excellent education by amplifying the power of neighborhoods and communities to lead education change, supporting schools to grow and excel in a thriving education ecosystem, and promoting racial equity in education. So the point of that is they are stating that they're trying to change communities, okay? You would want to assume that means for the better, but as Christians, we always have to question, right? Because we're not talking about people who share our values necessarily. We're talking about people who have different values potentially. So when they say they want to improve communities, what does that mean? It goes on to say it promotes equity, which is directly tied to critical race theory. That's my wording. It is directly tied to CRT. Even though, like we talked about before, they say they're not teaching CRT, and they're technically right because there's no classes for CRT in lower education. However, the whole theory behind CRT is you have an oppressor and you have the oppressed. And those are typically Caucasians versus people of color, although not always. They'll defend that. But most of the time, that's what CRT teaches. I don't care what races they are. That is a totally destructive theory to start with. We're all equal. No one should be pigeonholed and told they're oppressed and they're at a disadvantage to begin with. That doesn't make any sense. Everyone has the same laws on the books that apply to them. There is no disadvantaged group. There is no oppressed group. So they teach CRT through something called SEL, which is social emotional learning. And you've probably heard that term, but we're kind of going to go into detail about that. I have a mentor that I had worked with for a few years, and she actually goes into detail about explaining, and I can't do it justice like she does, the things we need to consider about social emotional learning. So I'm going to just break it down in a nutshell and give her credit. You have to think about it. Their point is we now have learning institutions. So it could be schools, lower education schools. It could be preschool. It could be colleges and universities. It could be vocational technical schools, whatever learning entities you have that are teaching people social, meaning society norms, and how to behave with their emotions, so emotional, and they're doing it through learning techniques and methodologies. When you talk about subjective subjects, they're subjective because there's no one definition for it. There's no solid truth behind it. It's based on somebody's opinion, and it can change and vary among different people that you talk to. The term social is exactly that. It's subjective. Emotional is subjective. You know what's not objective? Math, the English language, reading, some of the academia that we used to really focus on that we've kind of let go by the wayside, and that's why our kids can't do math and can't read. And I have a personal story about that as well. You think it's not in colleges? You're wrong. Number one, I was in college from 2017 to 19, late in life, went back to school, bachelor's program in a class. Teacher asked, and this was an adult learning program actually. So all the students were adults that worked full time, and we did the college full time, but it was in a totally different format. So to work with people that are in the workforce already. There was a guy I went to school with, and we had gone through several classes together. I didn't really know him, but this one particular teacher asked him to read something off the board that she had written up there. She just called on him randomly. And I'm telling you, he read like a first grader. He was sounding out words. He couldn't read some of the words on the board. The man was in his 40s, and he was a quality manager for a manufacturing plant. And he couldn't read. And he's in the bachelor's program. I was horrified. I thought, how did he make it through high school, let alone the associate's program? And now he's in the bachelor's program. And he's a quality manager in manufacturing. I couldn't understand how that happened. And now I do, because of all of this equity and diversity and inclusion stuff. I am not criticizing him. Please understand that. Our system failed him, just like it's failing all the kids who can't read based on the proficiency scores, and the kids who can't do math based on proficiency scores. But I'm also not going to dismiss the fact that parents are also responsible for that. If you think you can just have kids and send them off to the schools and they'll teach them everything they need to know, you're wrong. There are things that you have to do at home. You have to teach them, obviously, biblical principles, unless they go to a Christian school, and even then it's questionable. Biblical principles at home. You also need to be working with your kids on their skills, their skill sets, their reading, their math. Yes, you should be working with your kids on that. So to me, it was not that guy's fault. I was horrified that he couldn't read, and he was his age, and he was in this program, of course. But it's not fair to him, is the point. It wasn't fair to him. And I felt bad for him, because think about, on a daily basis, him trying to do a job where you have to deal with standard operating procedures, SOPs, policies, procedures as a quality manager, especially in manufacturing. And how's he supposed to effectively do his job? I don't know. Let's go to slide 16. Again, this is the Mind Trust, and they're focused on transformative education rooted in equity. This is an Indiana organization that I did a little bit of research on. I still have to do a lot more, but basically, they're stating they invest in public education to transform lives in neighborhoods across Indianapolis. We work with our community toward a day when race and income are no longer predictors of life outcomes. All right, let's look at their staff members. Slide 17. This is just one of the panels of staff members that I pulled a screenshot of, but the point of this is I want you to notice they have people dedicated to leadership and racial equity. There's that equity word again, and we're going to talk about that. Let's go to slide 18. The guy in the bottom right, Stephen Jones, I want you to note he's a board member for the Mind Trust, and he's the the Dean for Professional Development and Director for Malcolm X Institute Black Studies at Wabash College. All right. Who was Malcolm X? He was a Marxist. And so this guy who teaches Malcolm X studies, I'm not trying to judge racially at all. I'm calling it on political. he's actually a board member for the Mind Trust. Let's go to slide 19. So let's talk about equity. What do they mean by equity? They say we operate with the unwavering belief that all students and communities deserve the opportunity to thrive. Sounds great. Because of this, we invest in ideas and leaders to build systems that eliminate barriers, elevate opportunity, and amplify the power of communities. So this is some organization that works with the school system, and they talk about building systems that eliminate barriers. What does that mean? Do you understand the political speak in all of this? It's a lot of words that sound great, but we have no idea what they're doing. All right. So that's the point. How are they elevating opportunity and amplifying the power of communities? What does that mean? And then they talk about impact. We act boldly and persistently to create outstanding educational opportunities for all students across our city, both now and in the future. Love that. That's great. We believe that great schools lead students to academic success and transform communities. There it is again. And create new opportunities in the lives of students. What is this transformation they're trying to do? What does that mean? Just so you know, equality means opportunity, equal opportunity, but equity means equal outcomes, two totally different ends of the spectrum. Our Bill of Rights states that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It does not say that we have to make everybody start from the same starting point because that's fair. No, it gives us the right to equal opportunity, not outcomes. If Josh and I If Josh and I went to some kind of IT technical class together, which I have to tell you, Josh is a lot better at hardware and networking and all that than I am. I'm on the software side. If he and I went to an IT class on, hooking up a whole VPN network for a company, I guarantee you Josh would do better than I would. Does that mean I'm deficient? No, it means it's just not in my wheelhouse. It's something Josh is better at. I can accept that. Maybe I need to pursue something else. But just because I'm a female and Josh is a male and he's going to excel at that class, it doesn't mean it's because I'm a female that I'm not. That's my point. We don't all have to start from the same place. But maybe I could excel there if I work harder than Josh. Josh may not have to work as hard. That's a fact. All right. So my outcome could be better than Josh's, even though I'm going in more deficient than Josh to start with. Okay. So that's the point. Supporters of equity will argue that equality only works if everyone starts from the same place. But equity is more about providing the same access. So we cannot get that confused. Everyone in the country is equal as far as opportunity. We all have opportunities available. Nobody is sitting with a big gavel saying, these opportunities belong to only these people and not these people. We don't have laws written that way. We don't have people singled out because of anything. Our laws are general. They apply to every one of us. There's no special treatment right now for special groups. But I submit to you that the whole point of the equity part of what they're pushing is that they want them to. They want them to segregate groups because then that's equal outcomes, right? They can make special perks for this group as opposed to this group, and still you have someone making the decisions that isn't you. So that's one of the things that I think is very dangerous about this and about teaching kids about this. Let's go to slide 20. This is from a group called Positive Action SEL Training. Here they say effective social and emotional learning for everyone. They say students want to learn and feel connected to school. Teachers need a partner that understands their needs. Parents are eager to support and participate. Administrators seek to create a safe and welcoming environment. Nurture each role with positive action. That's their tagline at the bottom. In their users or uses section, let's go to slide 21. They have 3 goals on the left: improve, reduce, and expand. And then within each one, they elaborate next to each one about what they want to do with that. So they want to improve social emotional learning, career education, I skipped the improve and reduce and went straight to the expand. They want to expand social emotional learning. They want to expand character education. What does that mean? What's character education? What was another one on here I was looking at? Of course, life skills. That's very subjective again. They want to expand brain-based learning. What does that mean? Bottom line is, in that, there's a whole combination of SEL, social emotional learning, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, I call it DIE, just me. Character education, and we don't even know what they mean by any of this. Let's go to slide 22. So let's look at what they say as an example about a student who made an inappropriate comment in a class. And this is advice to teachers on how to implement this SEL. It's an example. So they say, start by calmly and respectfully addressing the student's remark by saying, quote, I want to bring our attention to a comment that was just made. It's important to understand why this statement is harmful because it perpetuates stereotypes and can make others feel excluded or marginalized, unquote. Then they say, next, connect the remark to the broader concept of equity, explaining how it goes against the values of, and they have this bolded, fairness, respect, and inclusion. Then they say, emphasize the importance of creating a classroom environment that promotes equity and celebrates diversity by adding, quote, in our classroom, we strive to create an environment where everyone feels respected and valued. Or, this comment doesn't align with our goal of promoting equity, which means treating everyone fairly and recognizing the unique perspectives and experiences each person brings. Okay, so I want to talk through this a little bit because, again, it's one of those things that sounds perfect on the outside. That is just amazing. Yes, we want everyone to be respected. We want everyone to be treated fairly and well, right? But I want to give you a little curveball. So, as a Christian, what if the teacher deemed that inappropriate comment to be somebody misusing someone's pronouns or misgendering them or calling them the wrong name based on gender? I want you to know that falls under a disrespectful comment. It absolutely does, per SEL. So if your child is in a classroom with someone who identifies as trans and they have different pronouns, or let's just say they identify as trans, but you can't really tell it very much. And so your kid accidentally uses the wrong pronouns, or to describe them. By the way, pronouns aren't in a one-to-one conversation with that person, so I don't know how they would really know unless they overheard you or someone told them. But let's use the wrong name for the sake of this argument. Your child will be corrected by the school because that is considered disrespect for others. Now, you may be okay with that, but there may be parents that aren't okay with that because they feel it's promoting living in a fantasy world for their kids. and they want their kids to know truth and reality and not kowtow to someone else's fantasy. Let's take that a step further, and I'm going to be talking about this on another upcoming episode. There are furries in schools. I know for a fact of one locally, a teacher, he was actually a librarian in an elementary school, who told me a story about a little girl who would come into the library, but she would crawl on all fours and she meowed, and she had the cat ears and the tail, and she really thought she was a cat, or at least pretended to be one. And he was not allowed to do anything with that child. When she came in, he had to immediately call this other special person in the school office, and they would come down and escort her around and ensure that she was protected to act like a cat, that no one interfered with her meowing or hissing or crawling around on her hands and knees. If your child didn't want to acknowledge that fantasy, that would be considered disrespectful, and it would result in corrective action, whether it be, addressing them in front of the class, or, this website gives a lot of examples. I have another one, slide 23. Let's talk about that one on how teachers can handle these. This one says, create a safe space for students to engage in a respectful dialogue about the remark and the underlying biases or background knowledge that may have influenced it. Do you think that could be Christianity? Do you think that could apply to church? That a secular person might say that you go to church and you have religion and you believe in God and you live by the Bible, and so that's a bias or something that may have influenced you to disrespect someone? It then goes on to say, encourage students to reflect on their own experiences and beliefs, facilitating a deeper understanding of the issue. And then another option, spark the conversation by stating, quote, now let's have a respectful conversation about this topic. I would like to hear your thoughts on the remark and the biases or background knowledge that may have influenced it. Please raise your hand if you have something to contribute, unquote. So this is a place where teachers can actually get your kids, as Christian kids or, churched kids, however you want to put it, who have a conviction about the truth and have been taught the truth, to confess their bias, which bias is a negative term. And they do a lot of training in companies. I know a few of mine have, and my friends' companies are doing it all of a sudden. The unconscious bias training and background knowledge, so they can actually put your kid on the spot and make them confess their bias. Now, how do you think your child's going to feel? How do you think your child might feel if another child in the classroom did that and then did something where they deemed it disrespectful to another kid, and then the teacher addresses the whole class, and it's that kid that did it, and they're your friend at church? Do you think your kid will be dissuaded or influenced in a negative way about their Christianity or their values or their morals that you teach them at home by that action? Of course they will. Let's go to slide 24. Here's another example. Can anyone share how this remark might perpetuate stereotypes? What do you think is a more equitable and inclusive approach to discussing this topic? Through dialogue, students learn to challenge their own biases and reflect on the cultural, social, and historical factors that shape their perspectives. Additionally, engaging in a classroom discussion allows students to consider different viewpoints, fostering empathy and the ability to see issues from diverse perspectives. That's a mouthful. Through dialogue, students learn to challenge their own biases and reflect on the cultural, social, and historical factors that shape their perspectives. That, to me, is, again, very dangerous as a Christian, because, again, they're promoting the fact that if you don't accept, or not even accept, accept is the wrong word, because you can be kind to people who live a lifestyle that you don't agree with. Okay, so it's not even about that. But using the wrong name or pronoun to someone else about that person is considered, a major offense that you have to have some kind of discussion in the classroom about. I don't know about this. It's indoctrination to me. There was a school conference for school employees in Indiana that I attended, and there was a session on SEL and a session on DEI. And I have hidden camera video. Yes, I went with hidden camera of an administrator for a very affluent area school who presented on SEL. And I learned that, with curriculum, they're required in Indiana to let parents see the curriculum. So the curriculum is a plan. It's written out. It's documented. It's tight. However, they are not required to inform parents of anything they do that isn't in the curriculum. So what they were doing at their school is they every day had a calendar marked with a value. And that would be the value of the day. And the teacher's first period would get all the kids in a big circle, and they would talk about that value for the day. But not only that, every teacher after that throughout the day would incorporate that value into their teaching. So think about that. You've got this value that some secular person determined was good, and it could be good. It could be. You've got, let's pretend they're in a school where they change classes every hour, okay? So you've got 7 periods. So your first period, you get this circle and you talk about the value for the day, and it's great. You go to first period and it's math class, and somehow they find a way to incorporate that value into math. And then you go to your next class, it's English class, and somehow they find a way to incorporate that value into that class. And then you go to history class, and somehow they find a way to incorporate that value into history. But the difference in history is you have an activist teacher who's a progressive, who embraces all of the progressive nonsense from all this stuff. They've got your child for an hour a day, every day for the school year. Do you want that person teaching your child what respect for others means? Because their idea of respect for others might be very, very, very different than yours. I guarantee it's not going to be a biblical perspective. And that's what we're seeing happening in schools all over the nation. We have these activist teachers who have come up through the ranks, through the universities, teaching this stuff to them in their college classes for their program to become a teacher. And then they're transferring it to their kids. I'm sure you've seen the videos of some of these progressives that are really out there. They're also teachers. There's some places on X, some pages that I follow. One is Chalkboard Heresy, and another one's Wide Awake Media. And they post videos all the time. You probably know about Libs of TikTok. They're posting videos of these activist teachers constantly because they're capturing hidden video of them in the classrooms. So let's talk a little bit more about what SEL is, just to narrow it down. It's values-based. It's taught through circle time at the beginning of the day, that particular school, and then incorporated into all classes. And I will tell you that the guidance for incorporating SEL does say that, to incorporate it throughout the day into every class. They do give that guidance for teachers in their technical manual. There is no transparency for parents when they do that, because it's not part of the written curriculum. So they don't have to share it with you, and they don't have to inform you of it. They might send a form home to tell you what they're focusing on that week. They may not. They're not required to, is the point. So you have no idea what they're doing. I don't embrace or promote disrespecting people of any kind. Just so you know, I would not treat people unkindly, even though I disagree with the ideology. Let's talk about DEI now. Again, it's oppressor versus oppressed. There's really an arrogance found in the assumptions of that, because it assumes people of color are oppressed, and it assumes that Caucasians are the oppressor. It's not always the Caucasians versus people of color, but that seems to be the main one that's being focused on. It could be other things as well. It focuses on victimhood. So someone has to be the victim if they're the oppressed, which to me labels, if you're talking about kids, it puts a label on them. They can't fight that. They're not equipped mentally or emotionally to fight that. So you're actually teaching them that they're a victim right out of the gate. It can mean compromising Christian values, but there are plenty of successful people of color that I would argue against this for. There's plenty of successful people of any group. It feels to me, and I've been researching this for a long time and I can't seem to shake it, that the people that support this stuff are trying to get us back segregated. They're trying to get us back to segregation. They want to return us to that. Why? I have no idea. This country fought so hard to get past that and to put it behind us. But it seems like the people that are pushing this are stirring the pot and trying to make it come back for whatever reason. I don't know. It's just an overview that I've seen. Again, some of these things are not bad things to teach, and it's not about what they're teaching. It's about how they're teaching it. That's the key. Do you as a parent know? Not necessarily. So you need to be talking to your kids about it and finding out, or talking to the school. All right. So back to this sustainability development goals. Slide 25. Now we're looking at target 4.7. It says by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. This is talking about sustainable development typically applying to climate and to keeping the earth healthy and, not ending. But I want you to notice, we talked about this on the last episode, how they link everything together. Remember, we talked about the sustainability goals are all being integrated and interwoven. And so they're accomplishing several with one initiative. This is where that comes into play. So what are the indicators? The extent to which global citizenship education and education for sustainable development are mainstreamed in national education policies, curricula, teacher education, and student assessment. Keywords there: global citizenship education, mainstreamed in national education policies, into curriculum, teacher education, and student assessment. They're wanting global citizenship to be primary. And it also says all students or all learners, which would include your preschool kids. As far as student assessments, there's a warning to issue on that. There's a software called Panorama that captures student data, and they will have your schools do this. You can opt them out, and I recommend you do that, but they will have your students take assessments throughout the year. But it's very invasive personal questions about home life included in it, which means they have your info. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that someone who's an activist could use that data against you in your own home. So if I were you, I would seek out the opt-out forms. They have to give you that option. Opt your kids out of the assessments. Let's go to slide 26. Target 4A. build and upgrade education facilities that are child disability and gender sensitive, and provide safe, nonviolent, inclusive, and effective learning environments for all. I don't understand how a facility can be gender sensitive unless they're talking about bathrooms. I'm not sure about that. Bathrooms, locker rooms. 4A1 is the indicator. It says proportion of schools offering basic services by type of service. So that's how they're measuring the achievement on that target. But I will say this actually, we talked about the whole school, whole community, whole child initiative from the CDC. We touched on that briefly in the last episode. This goes along with that, and this is where the CDC gets plugged into the globalist agenda. They also talked about basic services by type of service in the indicators. And in episode 4, we talked about this WISC initiative, whole school, whole community, whole child initiative from the CDC. We went through a virtual school and talked about all the services they would offer. This is an integration. Basically, the CDC's integration of the services is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 4A. So again, I'm tying all this back to the globalist agenda. Even though the CDC is U.S. only, they do have a voice in the world outside of the U.S., as indicated by the pandemic, but they are working to achieve these sustainability goals. I was going to go into a history of public education and the Department of Education because I think everybody needs to understand that foundationally. I'm just going to touch on a couple here. The free public schooling became available in 1820. Remember, I keep saying this goes way back. I had no idea how far back it went myself until I did the research. And that's been about over the past 3 years. In 1960s, SEL was introduced at the Yale School of Medicine, and DEI started in corporate America. It was introduced as part of affirmative action and part of the civil rights movement. So SEL and DEI, we've only been hearing about it for the past few years, but it's been around since the 1960s. Right before that, the theory of evolution was introduced in schools in 1859. I had no idea that went back that far either, as Christians were usually creationists. I know for a fact that we should be as Christians, and as anybody really, because you look at the human body and the complexity, and how can you argue that there wasn't an intelligent designer? But that's a whole nother topic for another day. The theory of evolution was introduced in 1959. And at that point, our kids started being taught they were animals. They were no different than animals. They evolved from animals. All right, think of how many decades later we're at. And all these decades, these kids have been taught they're animals, and now they're grown adults. I mean, generations well before me have been taught that. Let's face it, the majority of people go to public schools. They don't go to private schools. They're not homeschooled. The majority of people go to public schools. My thing is now, with all the crime, the attacks at schools, and so on and so forth, I'm going to pull a Dr. Phil. I don't ask myself why they're doing it. I ask myself why not. Because if they were taught they're animals, why would they not act like animals? If we took God out of the school system, then why, and they're not getting it at home, then why would they fear anything at all? They only think of earthly consequences. And we know now in this current society, in our culture war, the prosecutors aren't even pressing charges. They're not even prosecuting these people. They're just flipping the card and sending them home, putting them on probation, sending them back out. So, I mean, this is part of the reason we're in the place we're at. 1946, social change and national purpose was implemented in schools. Social change. That became a primary goal. In 1974, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, was implemented. Now, FERPA, if you know anything about HIPAA, you've probably heard of HIPAA. FERPA is the school's version of that. It's all about privacy and rights. And I find it interesting because FERPA talks about parents' rights, but it also has a section on students' rights. If you go and do a Google search, you're going to find, and I didn't know this until, last year, there is a Child's Bill of Rights from the UN. In the US, we haven't technically adopted it, but we're still utilizing it because it came from the UN. It's being incorporated in through the Department of Education federally, locally, and integrated into the schools. And in that, there are occasions where these students request privacy from their parents. So the schools honor the children's wishes more than the parents' wishes or what's right. So they are holding information and they do have precedent to do it. So just know that as well. Stay on top of it. SEL and DEI didn't become popular until the 1990s, though, in the schools. As of 2005, there was a bill passed by Congress that creationism could not be taught in schools anymore. That's fairly recent, and I thought it had happened before that, but no, it happened in 2005. In 2012, of course, we got rid of cursive writing, and Common Core was implemented. If you don't know about Common Core, do some research, please. In 2015, so we had the No Child Left Behind Act, which was in 2001, enacted in 2001, and that was supposed to implement the standardized testing. That's what actually got that standardized testing in place. In 2015, they replaced it with Every Student Succeeds Act, which is ESSA, E-S-S-A. I can tell you the rumblings I hear are that they want to get rid of standardized testing fully. I believe it has to do with Common Core and what a failure that's been. But I know there are universities and colleges already that aren't requiring an SAT or ACT for admissions. So I don't know. I think standardized testing should be done, but because of the DEI aspect, there's a lot of reading I did, and we might cover some of it in a minute, about how with standardized testing, it's unfair for some groups, like if they speak English as a second language, for example. So people are trying to do away with standardized testing altogether. In 2020, obviously, DEI increased. Racial justice and equity was introduced at schools. Now, we have a federal Department of Education. We have federal laws, Title 34 in the Code of Federal Regulations that deals with education, but each state has their own Department of Education, and those govern the curriculum for that state. Now, the public schools obviously have to comply with the standards set by the state Department of Education. But did you know that private schools also have to if they take vouchers? Now, there's been a big push for the voucher program, school choice, whatever. But if they take vouchers, they have to, let me rephrase that. If they take vouchers and they're not attached to a church, they have to comply with the state standards, which means they're teaching the SEL and DEI and all the other things. Okay, let's go to slide 27. So what does this Department of Education require in regards to social and emotional development? The student indicators are below, and that's what I kind of want to focus on. Identifies emotions within varying contexts. This is talking about the student. Describes an array of feelings. Describes empathy. Describes diversity in people in our world. Identifies differences in perspective. Identifies respectful behavior towards self and others. Describes ways in which students can support those who are bullied or experiencing personal challenges, including reporting mechanisms. Again, most of these things sound very virtuous on the surface. I can't stress enough, though, you can't depend on that. You have to know who's administering this. These are all subjective value-based behaviors. Subjective means it's subject to change. It's variable. So ask yourself who's deciding what these mean and how they're being taught and implemented in the classrooms. Again, think about children who react and how they react to positive reinforcement as well. So it may not be, someone who's criticizing your child for doing something that they don't think is right. It could be that they're using positive reinforcement when they do something they agree with to try to change the behavior that way. Our brain development isn't fully developed until in our 20s. We all should know that by now. And if you are taking your kid to Sunday school once a week, 1 hour a week, maybe you're doing devotions here and there at home or talking to them a little bit, and you think that is going to be enough to protect your child against an activist teacher who either has them maybe 1 hour a day every day of the school year or all day every day of the school year, you need to rethink, because it's not enough. Who's going to win that fight? And if your kids are around peers who are also being taught that, then you've got the peer pressure to comply. So just be thinking about that. Please also go to the American School Counselor Association's website. It's called ASCA, because this is the main organization that school counselors adhere to. And when we're talking about school counselors, we're talking about the mental health aspect, and we're talking about respect for others and the SEL values and all the things. And so I want you to check that website out. Slide 28. Let's look at a part of it, though. This is the mindset standards according to their documentation. School counselors encourage the following mindsets for all students. Belief in development of whole self. Remember, whole child, whole community, whole school. Including a healthy balance of mental, social, emotional, and physical well-being. A sense of acceptance, respect, support, and inclusion for self and others in the school environment. A positive attitude toward work and learning. Self-confidence and ability to succeed. Belief in using abilities to their fullest to achieve high-quality results and outcomes. Understanding that post-secondary education and lifelong learning are necessary for long-term success. Are they, though? I mean, lifelong learning, okay, we all learn something every day, right? And we should be, trying to better ourselves. But I'm not sure that's what they mean here. I think they mean academia. And I would push back on that last one with maybe vocational technical training. Could be an alternative. Not everybody's cut out for college. But the main one I want to talk about is that development of whole self, including a healthy balance of mental, social, emotional, and physical well-being. Again, I'm going to say it again. Who's defining what that means? What does it mean? Sense of acceptance. Well, we know that can be dangerous to Christians, right? Because we can accept people and be friendly to them and mannerly toward them. To me, that's respect without embracing the things they're doing. We do it all the time in life as adults. We can do that. However, it seems like the other side can't seem to fathom that. So have you heard microaggressions? That's a way of, labeling something you said that you didn't mean in any way negative, but they take it negative and they put it back on you. That is an example of how they could be doing this, dealing with this sense of acceptance, inclusion for self and others in the school environment. All right, if my kid's a Christian and there's a Satanist kid, they're going to be okay as long as they're not talking about what they do. Or, the Satanist kid isn't trying to put, some kind of spell on my kid or trying to get him to do something evil. Okay, so if my kid doesn't want to participate in that, does that mean they're not being respectful? That's what you need to be thinking about and preparing yourself for. Okay, let's go to slide 29. There's a document called Mindsets and Behaviors. It's a PDF document from schoolcounselor.org. And this is what school counselors are advised to do. It says this combination of direct and indirect student services facilitates systemic change and affects students' abilities to attain the Ask a Student standards. School counselors should advocate for policies, practices, and guidelines that dismantle bias and promote equity for all. Lead efforts to challenge policies, procedures, practices, traditions, customs, or other behaviors perpetuating intentional or unintentional biased behaviors. How do you know it's biased if you're not aware of it and it's unintentional? I mean, I don't understand. And outcomes. So it's not just behaviors, but it's outcomes too. Serve on school and district committees focused on ending bias, including committees addressing academic content. Advocate for learning materials and resources in all content areas that promote diversity and inclusion and address systemic barriers, and on and on. I like the last one. Present workshops for parents and families on how to foster and support respectful student behaviors. Again, when you present workshops, it's usually you're in a place of authority, right? So it sounds to me like we school counselors know best and we're going to educate y'all parents. I don't agree with that. And whatever. Some of the resources that they use, there's a site called Learning for Justice. You can find this document. It's Social Justice Standards, a Framework for Anti-Bias Education. That's going to give you some insight, and these references will be below. There's another source for CASEL. We're going to talk about that on the next episode. CASEL is interesting. That is the Social and Emotional Learning Core Competencies. And we're going to go into detail on CASEL and something called SEEKUS in the next episode, so I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Tune in for that podcast. Bottom line is, I hope you learned a lot from this podcast. I know I'm presenting a lot of really, really deep material, and I'm trying to go fast through it, so I'm not probably driving home some of the points that I would have preferred to. And I'm new at this. So please put in the comments if you find it to be helpful. If you don't, if you have some constructive criticism, I'm open to that. As Christians, though, we have to be aware that our job is to protect our kids. Our job is to make sure that we're training them up in the way they should go. We should not, as Ken Ham said, be like the Israelites and just turn our kids over to the Palestinians. That's not acceptable. I don't believe that that is something God would bless. And I think it will bring detriment to our children and their future and their spiritual life, definitely. So what can we do? Number one, talk with your children. Always be in tune with them. As my job in this is to do the research that y'all don't have time to do. I've been working on this stuff for several years and digging. So on the podcast, I don't present a lot of detail necessarily. Sometimes I do. Hush, Josh. I know I ran long on the last few, but I think this is building foundation, and then the podcast will get maybe shorter later. We have to get this foundation right, though. And I feel the need to educate you all so that you know what's happening, so that you can accurately approach your kids and have that conversation and ask specific questions, because we all know kids like to say fine when you ask them a question, or okay. So get that conversation going with your kids. Another option, get involved in a school board. I know we've heard a lot about that over the past couple years, maybe 3 or 4 years. Definitely try to do that, because the school boards, even though the Department of Education dictates the curriculum, that's that's like a standard operating procedure, which is the bare minimum that has to be done. But the school boards determine a lot for your independent schools in your area. So definitely do that. Follow the legislation about education, and make sure you're reaching out to your senators and congressmen or congresswomen. If you have something that you oppose, if you have something that you support, make your voice heard. Another option that has changed in recent history, homeschooling or micro schools are a thing now. And there's organizations that can help you either find a homeschool co-op type of thing or help you with starting a homeschool initiative with your kids. It's not what I thought it was years ago. I thought it was I had to quit my job and do teaching full time. And how could I do that as a single mom? There's no way. And it's not like that at all. The maximum, and I want you to think about this, the maximum you have to spend on this is about 2 to 3 hours a day. Your kids doing homework and schoolwork. It sounds ridiculous because they're at school all day long, but think about, they're changing classes. They have PE, they have recess, they have lunch, they have, all these different things that cause them to be at school all day. When you're homeschooling, it's focused on curriculum, dead focused on it. You don't have the other distractions, although you can throw those things in and, your kids can, after hour 1, take recess. I mean, it's just so flexible. So it can be done. And then as far as the co-ops go, there are homeschool opportunities where parents help each other out with childcare for working parents. So do look into those. Another thing you can do is run for office. And the last thing you can do, please pray. It should be the first on the list, but pray for our country. I'm seeing some things changing. People are waking up, and that's the goal. We will be held accountable for what we do as parents. God will hold us accountable for that. So we want to make sure that we're on the right page and being aware and working with the content that we find out. Doing nothing, knowing what you know now, is the equivalent of complicity. You choose to do nothing after hearing this content, then you're complicit in it. And I hate to see kids go astray. Hate to see it. So again, on the next episode, we're going to continue the discussion about Castle and Seekus and some of the deeper, more adult content. Definitely tune in for that. And as always, if you like this content, subscribe, please. Like, share, and comment. Comments push everything up in the algorithm. Actually, each one of those actions does. So make sure you're doing all 4. And special shout out to Revolver Broadcasting and Josh for a fantastic opportunity. I'm so grateful to have this platform. So thanks to you all for that. And with that, have a good night. I'll see you next time.